Let's start with a jig that we used when we built this break front cabinet recently. It's one to drill the adjustable shelf pin holes. There are holes 1 inch on center that take these little support pins. Now it's critical that all the holes be level so that the shelf will be level. I made the holes in that break front using a very simple jig, just a piece of plywood with a series of holes. That jig was inspired by a commercially made one that was sent to us by a friend of the show. Now today, we're going to build a new Yankee version. With use, there are always improvements that can be made. Now if you'd like the plans for this jig or any of the other ones we're going to build today, or we've done over these 2 special programs, a measure drawing is available and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. For our new jig, I'm starting with a piece of 1/2 inch cabinet grade plywood, 8 inches wide, 36 inches long. I've laid out a center line, which will be used when we actually use the jig, but it's also the layout for everything else. There's another line along this direction, and the first step is to drill some holes for this collar, which goes in the router, and there'll be 1 inch on center all the way down this line. To make those holes, I've set up my drill press with a 5/8 inch Forstner bit. I've put a piece of plywood on the base so the bit won't hit the metal, and I've set up a fence. Square back from the bit is a line on the fence, and that's my index. I'll drill a hole right there in the center, slide it 1 inch, drill a hole, and continue until I get all the holes I need. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. The Forstner bit is a good choice here, as it won't tear out the plywood on the back side, particularly with the backer board. Here I've switched to a 1/4 inch bit, and I'm drilling 1 hole at each end of the jig. And what that's for is to register the jig if I need a series of holes greater than the ones that the jig can do. I'll show you how that works in a little while. Let's look at the differences between the old jig and the new jig. First of all, the new jig is wider. The line of holes on the new jig is closer to one edge, but not so close that I won't have good support from my router. Now this extra width is going to give me an adjustment feature. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If I was to take this piece of mahogany plywood that was left over from our kitchen secretary, which also has adjustable shelves, and I wanted to make this into a wall cabinet with a series of holes, the first thing I do is divide the height in half and put a line right at the center. That becomes the key for the jig, which also has a center line. Almost all these jigs have a center line. Now for the distance in from the edge for the series of holes, on this jig I simply used pencil marks. This is 1.5 inches, this is 2, this is 2 1/4. So let's say I'm going to use 1.5 inches. I got to line up this end, the middle, and the other end, and then clamp it in place. And that can be a little time consuming. On the commercial jigs, they have a pin in 1/4 inch increments to set that distance. I would like to have a finer adjustment, so what I'm going to do is cut a slot here so that we can mount a bar underneath and have a good range of adjustment. So I've put a straight edge clamp across the piece, set up the router with a 1/4 inch bit. Distance from the center of the router to the edge is equal to the jig to the layout, and I'm just going to cut a slot all the way through. Okay, now we'll flip the jig around and make the same hole on the other end. The only other part of this jig is the stop, just a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I cut a little bit longer than the jig itself. It's about 1/4 inch on each end. I'll hold it flush with the side, and then just take a pencil and mark the slot so that I can drill a hole for the bolt I'm going to use. For a reference, I'm going to put marks every 1/4 inch at each end. And these vertical lines will make it a lot easier to adjust the stop. To attach the stop to the main part of the jig, I'm just using a 1/4 inch carriage bolt. We'll drop that down through the slot and spin it around so the square part of the carriage bolt is in the slot. Take a wing nut and use that to lock it down. Well, let's try it out and make some holes in this piece of plywood, which could be for a mythical cabinet. I've set the stop so that it's 1.5 inches from the center of my holes. Just run that up against the side of the piece, come to the middle, line up the center points, and then clamp the whole assembly to my workbench. I've installed the collar in my router, and I have a 1/4 inch spiral bit. The depth is set so that it'll cut 1/2 inch into the plywood. I start at one end, work my way down. Okay, just pop off the clamps, and we have a nice series of holes evenly spaced. Now to do the other side, I just turn the piece around, set it up again, and do the same thing. One of the appealing things about our desktop writing case is the joinery at the corners. These are called box joints. You might have seen them on old cigar boxes or cream cheese boxes, even saw them on boxes that held hardware. It's a beautiful joint, and it's very strong because of all these surface areas where you can put glue. Very easy to make box joints with a jig at your table saw. You take the miter gauge, attach a piece of plywood to it, which has a pin and a slot, and then you have a loose gauge that matches the thickness of the slot and this pin. And your dado head set at 3/8 of an inch. Let's make another jig. I start out with a piece of the 3/4 inch MDO, and I've put a pencil line that's exactly 3/4 of an inch from the left-hand end. I bring that pencil line even with the end of my miter gauge and put a pencil mark for one of the screws. Almost all miter gauges have a place for screws. Now I just pre-drill the hole and attach it to the miter gauge. Just one pan head screw. The height of the dado is just a little over 3/4 of an inch. Let's make one pass through the back. The next step is critical. I want to take a piece of solid wood and make a pin that fits that slot exactly. It can't be too loose. So I removed the dado head, but left the height adjustment the same because I'm going to need the dado back in there in a minute. And I've set the fence for what should be an exact fit. Now let's see how we did. I'd say that is just right. We'll just shorten this stick a bit to make that pin. Now I'll just slip that pin in the slot, pre-drill a hole, and attach it with a screw. Okay, now what I want to do is remove the jig from the miter gauge and slide it over 3/4 of an inch and reattach it. With the jig reattached, I can make the second slot. All right, let's give it a try. Here are a couple pieces of scrap plywood that I'm going to join at the corner with box joints. Now the first step is to take one of the pieces and the gauge, which is the same width as the pin, put it up against the pin and make a pass. Now I remove this gauge, slide this piece over so that it's over the pin, take the adjoining piece, run it up against the pin, put a clamp to hold the pieces together, and make the next pass. Now it's just a matter of sliding the piece over, dropping it on the pin, making a pass until we get all the way across. Okay, let's give it a try. That's good. Not too tight, not too loose. Perfect box joints. This jig is going to come in handy. A few years ago, I built this marble roll, a series of chutes with holes that you can run marbles or balls down, and the kids love it. Now, to cut this catcher, which is a round piece, I made a jig for my router. I actually took a piece of 1/4 inch plywood and just screwed it to the router base. And to cut the circle, I just drove a screw at the diameter that I wanted, and I would just pivot the whole thing around, the router doing the work. Now you can make these jigs any size you want. You can make one big enough to cut a tabletop. I think I can make some improvements on this one. So what I've done is started out with a rectangular piece of plywood 3/8 of an inch thick, and I've laid out a center line. I've also taken the time to take the router base and lay out the holes for the screws that I'm going to use to attach.
Oh yes.
Beautiful kind of this high waistband thing as well. That
cut a slot right down the middle for this nut. To do that, I'm using my router with a 3/8 inch straight cutting bit, and I've adjusted my rip fence so that it'll be right in the center. The next step is to cut a hole for the router bit to pass through, so I've set up a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit. I'm changing bits here to a 3/16 inch diameter to drill the through holes for the screws. I've flipped the piece over to the other side, and this countersink will accept the screw head. Now at last, we'll cut the half circle and the tapers. Now I just take these 3/4 inch wide pieces of plywood. I'm going to nail those on to create a slightly narrower slot for the bolt. Okay, now for the pivot point, I'm going to use a small carriage bolt that goes through the narrow slot from the top, and then I put a nut on the underside. Now, when the nut is down in the lower slot, it can't turn as I tighten the screw. I can set the pin any place that I want. Using the screws that came with the standard router base, I simply attach the jig. Okay, let's make a test cut. I've got a piece of 3/4 inch plywood here that's about 14 1/4 inches wide. So I'll put a mark right about in the center. I'm going to cut a 14 inch diameter circle. Now I'll take a 1/4 inch brad point bit and drill a hole partway through. Now for the setup on the jig, I've torqued down the pin so that it's 7 inches from the center of the pin to this leading edge of the bit. Now I drop the pin over that reference hole, and a couple times around should cut all the way through. Okay, that's all there is to it. A few years ago I made this teak bar, and it featured louvered doors. Now I can't go to the home center and buy louvered doors made out of teak. This is a custom item. The trick to making louvered doors is to make slots in the stiles of the door that are perfectly matched. Otherwise, the slat's not going to be straight. That takes either a specialty machine or a jig, which is what I did. And the jig will allow me to cut both sides at the same time, making a perfect match. Now, how it works is that I use a router with a collar and a 1/4 inch bit, and the collar rides in these V-shaped slots. It would be nearly impossible to cut nice, crisp slots in the middle of a piece of plywood. But if you're willing to cut the jig in half and start with 2 pieces, I can lay it out, drill holes, and cut slots for the template. So the first thing I'm going to do is tack these 2 pieces together. Next, I'm going to drill some 1/2 inch holes, 2 inches on center, using this line on my fence as an indexing point. Using my bevel gauge, which I've set this inside angle to be 25 degrees, I'm extending lines from the hole out to the edge. The best tool to cut out this material to the hole is the band saw. If I use the circular saw, it would overcut. I don't want to do this freehand. I want very accurate cuts. Now, if I try to use my miter gauge to angle it, it doesn't go far enough back, and I can only turn it to 30 degrees for a setting, and that's not enough because I need 25. Now, if I was to take the miter gauge and turn it around, I get a little bit closer to the blade, but I'm still limited by 30 degrees. So what I'm going to do is go back to 90. and make a little jig that'll give me a 25-degree angle. The first part of that jig is this piece of plywood, which I'll clip off one end at 25 degrees. Here I'm attaching a narrow piece of plywood to that angled piece. Now this long, narrow piece will become the new fence. And now a couple screws to attach the jig to the miter gauge. The first pass will be to clip off some excess on this fence. Now I can use the intersection of the fence and that angle as a reference point to cut out the material to each hole. At this point, I can pop the pieces apart, turn them face to face or edge to edge, and then clamp them together. Here I'm applying some glue on the underside for this 1.5 wide strip of plywood, which goes between these lines, which are 3/4 of an inch from the joint. I'll secure the piece with some brads. Now I'll install these hardwood strips on each side of that 1/4 inch plywood, and that's where we'll sandwich the stiles when we route the slots. With the dado set at 1/4 of an inch, I've just made 2 grooves, and they're going to be for some stops. I'll show you where we use those later. I've installed the 1/2 inch collar on the router and installed a bit. Now I want to plunge through the 1/4 inch strip. Here I've clamped a couple pieces of pine in my side vise. These would be the stiles of a door. I've put a pencil mark right here, which is where the bottom rail will come in, and that's where I want the first louver slat to start. So I take the jig, drop it over the 2 stiles, and then I have to slide it until I get the pencil mark that I just made right at the bottom of the cutout in that 1/4 inch plywood. Right there. Then I'll put a clamp to secure it. Now I'm going to take this piece of 1/4 inch plywood and slip it in the left-hand groove. The idea is to take the router with the collar and start at the bottom of these right-hand slots. Keep pressure against the long side of each V-shaped piece and run it forward until the base hits that stop. I'll make all the slots in one style, move the stop, and do the corresponding style. That's good. Now I'll move the stop to the other side of the jig and route the corresponding style. Now I can pop off the jig, and you can see that I have mirror image slots for the slats every 2 inches. What I want to do now is put a slot every inch. So I take my square, which is 1 inch wide, go to my original mark, move it up an inch, reset the jig, go through the same process. Okay, and there you have 2 perfectly matched stiles for louver slats. One of the earliest projects I built here at the New Yankee workshop was this shaker wall clock. It's a reproduction of the one made by Brother Isaac Hayes out at the Hancock Shaker Village over 100 years ago. When he built his, he mortised for the hinges with a chisel and a mallet. When I built this one, I mortised for the hinges with a jig and a router. Now the jig is fairly simple. Just a piece of plywood with a stop and a little cutout that relates to the size of the hinge. Now there are a lot of different types of hinges, and that means I need an individual jig for each one. There are commercial versions available, and they'll handle most sizes, but I like to make my own because it doesn't take very long. Now over here I have a door clamped in the side vise, and I want to tell you why we mortise for the hinge. The hinge mortise makes the hinge flush with the edge of the door. That's the correct procedure. What that does is closes the gap between the door and the face frame. But more importantly, the hinge, this little pocket, provides an edge so that the door hangs on these very shallow shoulders rather than just on the screws themselves. Now let's suppose I have a room full of doors to do. Now I want to make a jig. And it's simple enough. I start out with a router with a 5/8 inch diameter collar and a 3/8 inch diameter bit. That means that the bit is 1/8 of an inch smaller than the collar. So I take a piece of plywood and I lay out for the hinge 1/8 of an inch bigger on 3 sides. I'll remove this material over at the table saw. Cutting this notch accurately is a very important part of making this jig. And it's not a problem if you have a table saw. It's really the only way you can do it. I wouldn't try to cut it with a jigsaw, and I wouldn't cut it on the bandsaw. What I want to do is bring it in using my miter gauge and nibble away the material. Okay, that takes care of the notch. I've got 1/8 of an inch all the way around to accommodate the collar on the router. And now what I want to do is just take a couple pieces of 1/4 inch plywood and nail those on as a stop. Well, let's give it a try. I clamp the jig with its center line aligning with the center line of the mortise, and I simply route it out. I'm cleaning the corners out using my corner chisel. I could certainly do it with a conventional chisel. Let's just slide the hinge in place. That's the way it should look. Jigs. Where would we be without them?